In Revelation 16, we find how the wrath of God is experienced in our lives. We find that those angels we met in Revelation 2 and 3, by using the earth's elements as presented in Revelation 4, have seemingly become devils, by tormenting us through these same earthly elements. If we are to come to know God, we must know both the face and the preface of what we do in all their aspects. We bring our memories into focus through what is happening in our lives. All of the happenings shown here are manifestations of the love of God. But we cannot know the full range and extent of it unless we suffer the consequences of our use of the forces. We might be lulled into thinking that these forces only affect us in relationships to each other, however, they affect every nerve and cell, every reaction of any force in the body, to the same extent that we notice in interpersonal reactions. The ego plus the known and unknown bastions of security we have built in consciousness, all are found to be our mental concepts which play a greater role in our everyday living than we had thought. All losses and humiliations to our ego, however, may not match the unconscious body reactions through the cellular pains and sores mentioned in verse 11. But how else are we to learn the justice involved in taking full responsibility for our actions? The wrath of God spoken of in Revelation 16 pictures to us a magnitude of love so far beyond our usual understanding that only through suffering will we be able to understand its enormity, for our concepts of love are all associated with indulgent emotions. Revelation 16 should help us remember our debts. We tend to forget the debts we owe to the mind and flesh combination we have in our now separated and non-natural bodies, as we learned of in Revelation 13. All of this may not be clear enough to give an understanding of the title patience comes to consciousness assigned to Revelation 16. However, when we notice where the emphasis is, in the body, verse by verse, it should be clear that the acceptance of responsibility, that is, patience, is really involved in every verse. The emphasis is on what happens, because we do not fully realize the effects of using the forces for self's purposes. Hence patience, or responsibility for our actions, is shown as the plagues we experience. These plagues may be looked at in this way. When our choices of actions and reactions are made, we automatically call upon one or more of them to form the idea to express what we want. The force does not know what we want but we do, thus we only allow, so we think, that portion of the force to come into expression. The unused portions are still a part of the action, but we do not notice them. The consciously unused portions, however, must find lodgment somewhere in us, especially if not in our expression. They wreak havoc on the body cells and cause all sorts of disturbances in all the cells' reactions. Thus there are all kinds of unrecognized disturbances brought about in the body. All kinds of diseases pop up in us and we suffer. They plague us. These unconscious reactions are the result of the neglected use of the full potential in the forces chosen to help us. Thus it is not the wrath of God against us, but our neglect which has returned to us to plague us. They are, in effect, our sins of omission, which cannot be forgiven except as we are thankful for their being brought to mind. The scenes pictured here in Revelation 16 are not in the Son of Man's sequential order of learning. The happenings shown in Revelation 16 started with Job and are the continuing efforts on the part of the higher self to lead us to the Father. The plagues in Revelation 16 are those things which plague the body and mind throughout all lives in the earth. Eventually we must come to realize we are not just one being, but are in essence three. When we will work with the three parts of us, body, mind and soul, we may remember what the self, Babylon, really is and begin our journey home.
And I heard a great voice out of the temple, saying to the seven angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth.
It may seem that we have gone 2/3 of the way through the revelation before we get to the real understanding of the church's angels associated with the planetary influences working in and through us. We seemed, at an earlier point, to have stopped before a possibly deeper understanding of their efforts. If so, it is because we were not yet ready to accept responsibility for the deeper causes of what we are. It may well be said that Revelation 16 continues delving into our beginnings, just as do the previous four, yet there is in each an element of everyday living that has its part in our beginnings. Here we are getting closer to knowing more about the forces and makings of the self, so that we may become better prepared to meet ourselves with some depth of understanding. In this verse, while the pouring out was upon the earth, it might seem to be only the earth forces themselves which were affected. The fact is that the pouring out was upon those activities involved in the meeting of self, in the broadest sense possible in all relationships in which we find ourselves. In the readings we find that the angels were pouring out the influences necessary in the fulfilling of the law. From the readings, we have this explanation. What is meant by the angels with the 7 vials, Revelation 16. This again is that fulfilling of the law. This is as the carrying forth in the earth of those influences that bring the wrath in the active forces, in the experience of the individuals. In this explanation we again find that the word wrath may seem to be the anger of God, however, if one will but substitute the words truth or understanding, we would have a broader sense of the meaning of the active forces in our experiences. The great voice here can be the voice of memories of the activities recorded in the temple. The voice of the recorder, which in this case would be the voice of the authority we have given to our memories to guide or to become us. The voice is from inside our tabernacle, just as it was shown to John, and relates to what we worship and hold to as holy. From the standpoint of the universal, this voice would be as from the subconscious mind of the soul, that part of mind which never left God and yet has a directing influence in our lives through other influences in the soul itself, which in this case is the creative forces we call the planetary influences. In this sense the forces, the angels, were told to go your ways, and their ways were to influence the activities of the soul, and through the soul to influence us. Hence we cannot directly see, nor know the manifestations of God except by reason of the actions in the soul which, in turn, may influence us, for the conscious mind of the soul, is our subconscious mind. We say may influence us, because our will may oppose those directions in the soul mind, for we cherish, and worship, our free use of will. It was God's gift to us, and hence we take the attitude that no one or nothing should have a right to interfere with our free use of it. For this reason the planetary influences must work behind the scenes we meet, because we choose to have the play go the way of our wants. All the more reason for us to watch the scene play itself out so that we may become acquainted with the producer. Those angelic creatures we call the planetary forces. The angels shown here who pour out the love, the knowledge of our potential of returning to the Father. Again, it may be seen that this wrath of God is only a realization of a battle of wills. Ours and God's. Which also is the manifestation of the unlimited love of God for man, for us.
And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image.
Here we might be reminded of Satan's first influence upon the body of Job. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. We do not mean that Job's experience was a retribution against him from God, we are trying to show how God, in effect, said to Satan, "Go thy way." This same experience indicates how we too might experience the love of God. Especially when we have the determination to stand still and know that I am God. Then we may see the meaning of the sign in heaven, great and marvelous. Since Job remained obedient to his determination to hold fast to his faith in God, just so we too might, and as did Jesus, learn obedience by the things which he suffered. We should consider this pouring out in the light of the readings. What is the symbol of the first vial and the pouring of it? These all are as the same, though are represented as the effective activity upon the various conditions that have become a part of the errors in those that have the mark of the beast. At some time or another all of us are subject to having the mark of the beast. In this we find that, while the influence so poured out as an effective activity upon the various conditions, the purpose is to try to affect those who are under the influence of beastly natures. Which we all are, and those result from the errors made, in getting entangled in the flesh. By reason of this do we create images which become the ruling influences in our lives. Perhaps we can understand this pouring out here a little better, if we consider the particular center of, endocrine, activity being affected by each of the 7 angels. While the above reading states that they are all the same, it means the pouring out of the angel's influence, not the results. They are influences of activities, regardless of what activity. In this particular verse, because it has to do with the earth's elements as well as the worship of the beast and his image, the pouring out here is upon the creative influences in us, which is the gonadal activity where all our images are created. Hence the entire endocrine system is affected and thus our conscious activities. But since this influence in us is that of Saturn, it is that influence to which all insufficient matter is cast for a remolding. The remolding process hurts and causes all kinds of noisome and grievous sores in the flesh body of man. And, in like manner, in the consciousness. The first angel, being that guarding and molding force in us, gets to the very heart of all our creative efforts where we create the forms of our desires, even our memories. Our imaginations should supply us with any particular illustration we need consider here. But the bothersome sores, even in the flesh, should tell us a lot about ourselves and how we got that way. This verse should become much clearer and more meaningful if read in conjunction with Revelation 2 verses 1 to 7. This verse presents the more universal influence behind the scenes and their activity, whereas the earlier section is more concerned with the actions and responses of the conscious physical body. Particularly relevant verses also are Revelation 6:2, regarding the opening of the first seal, and 8:7, showing the sounding of the first angel. All of the above should help us understand and appreciate more the promise made in Revelation 2:7. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. And this leads us right back to the Garden of Eden where it all began.
And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea.
This verse needs some explanation, not only in reference to blood of a dead man and to the seeming death of all souls in the sea, but more so in understanding how the universal forces have an effect in our daily lives. While the first part of the revelation is about the body and the latter portion tells us something about the universal forces. Which are, in fact, in back of the body forces. We need to see how these blend with the body forces in order to understand the purposes of both in our daily lives. In daily living, we focus on body desires and wants instead of looking at our needs in the broader context of the purposes of our very being. This second angel, light and center, is the force of the mystic in Neptune and thus relates to the life we give, not only to our offspring, but, perhaps more importantly, to the images we create which in turn become the us with whom we identify. The pouring out was upon the sea, and thus a three-pronged influence. The first is its natural function of reproduction of the species. Remember that the sea represents the source of the life force. Through the light and activity. The mystic, or mystique, of just how this happens is still a mystery to man. The second prong connects with the blood of a dead man. Jesus indicated that the only life was the life of the Spirit, and he once said, "Let the dead bury their dead." It might be asked, how can a dead one bury a dead one? The truth of the matter is that most all of us have given our life to the forms we have created, the thought-up images become things. For thoughts are things, and have given them the power to act in our stead as our habits. They in turn rule us. They live our lives. They are us, and hence we are as dead, for we have given our whole life to them, so that we have no life of our own. We then only experience the life of our dead images, for they have no real life in them. They have ours. It now belongs to them. We are as dead men, but do not yet know it. This is the reason Jesus said that we must become as little children. For as pointed out before, when we reach the point of self-identity, we have given our life to the forms of reactions which are us, our temperaments. This idea is addressed in the last portion of the present verse, and every living soul died in the sea. We have died to the soul. To our unconscious. Only the body and its images live on, and we are neither of them. The soul is as dead in the sea of life itself, and the lifeblood of us has become as the blood of a dead man. A fuller meaning and understanding of this verse can only be gained from correlating the activities presented in Revelation 2:8-11, the activities of the Leyden gland, with, of course, the opening of the second seal in Revelation 6 verses 3 and 4, and the sounding of the second angel in 8 verses 8 and 9. This verse expands our understanding of the life force in us, and how we use it. We may find that we are all negligent in paying attention to ourselves, and especially our conscious creative efforts. Regardless, though, we should find that there is more than rhetoric in Revelation 2:11, where a promise not usually understood is made. It is given here, "He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death." This idea we meet again later.
And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments.
These four verses are presented together, for they all relate to the pouring out by the third angel of the adrenal activities. Our debts and memories. In these verses we find that the soul's mind may still experience that needed to be met in the soul memory from past earth lives and or from those of the inter-between experiences. It is thus that the body may live on, though it be as dead, for the patterns of memories and needs in the soul can meet experiences whether the self consciously knows it or not. The impulses to meet them come from the various storehouses of memory in the body as indicated by the rivers and fountains of waters, and the spirit becomes the blood, the life force to the body for its reactions. It could also well be that these actions may sometimes seem to have no basis in us, for those crucial circumstances about which we can only wonder why. Thus the angel of the waters would recognize the righteousness of God, regardless of conscious memories or the will of man, and say, Thou art righteous, because thou hast judged thus. The judgment is right, for we have created our own images to worship, and we live under the dictates of the things we have created. We have abandoned the real creator as a supreme being in favor of our own being. We be the images, only, of our creations, our created concepts. It is interesting that there should be two sources of acclamation for the judgments of God shown here. The first from the angel of the waters we can understand, because all its efforts have not been for naught. In verse 7, however, there is another voice, which may or may not be that of an angel, yet by the phrase, I heard another, would indicate it is one. On this neither our imagination, intuition, nor any little voices have called for attention, nor given answer. However, we must not forget our two consciousnesses, and both are involved. Be that as it may, by rereading Revelation 2 verses 12-17. regarding our debts and the activities of the adrenals and correlating all the above with the opening of the third seal in Revelation 6:5 and the sounding of the third angel in Revelation 8 verses 10 and 11. Our understanding of the fulfilling of the law found in the above verse is further enhanced. Moreover, we better understand the enticement of the symbols found in Revelation 2:17, which we feel needs repeating. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth saving he that receiveth it.
And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory.
The pouring out here is at the thymus center, the seat of the image of the self, the ego. We are reminded of Revelation 6:12 wherein the sun turning black has to do with the giving away of the ego. The sun, the light of the life of the ego. To be sure, Revelation 6:12 is under the opening of the sixth seal, which has to do with mind, yet the lodgment of the image is at the thymus center. Power was given to this angel to scorch men with fire. Here is the seat of the self-identification whose claims of being the self are based upon the acceptance of the images we create at the propagation level, give life to and set before the self as being us. It is here that these images are tried as by fire, and, if found insufficient, are cast again unto Saturn, the alchemical furnace, for a remolding. It seems there is enough fire around this entity to scorch the whole earth. And probably is. For we are later shown in Revelation 19:20 that this image, along with the beast, is cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. This fire causes man to blaspheme the name of God because of the other plagues. The self repented not because an image only has power to be itself. It could not repent, rethink its deeds, for it takes its orders from the self's will. Thus it did not honor or give the glory, service, to God. We should take heart, even though the above may seem confusing, because in Revelation 2:28 we find that this same identity, by overcoming, shall have so great a power as to rule the body completely and as a reward receive the morning star. But that overcoming is just what is pictured here by the pouring out of the vials. To help with this understanding, we should restudy Revelation 2 verses 18 to 29, relating to the thymus gland's activities, together with the opening of the fourth seal found in Revelation 6:7 to 8, and correlate all the above with the results of the fourth angel sounding found in Revelation 8 verses 12 and 13.
And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds.
The fifth center, related to the will, is the seat of the battle of in us, thus is the seat of the beast. The spirit of rebellion. The power of the will seems to close the mind to other, and possibly greater insights and understandings. This alone would cause us to be full of darkness. We are so frustrated by either ignorance or the inability to gain some kind of insight into things facing us that we literally gnaw our tongues in anger or rebellion. Of course we blaspheme God. Mostly because of this self-inflicted suffering. Verse 11 is a re-emphasis of the torment shown in verse 10. And maybe, because of the possible danger to the self, it should be re-emphasized, for here is where we may become such as to be clothed in white raiment, and are promised that, if we would overcome, our names would not be blotted out of the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and his angels. For further understanding, look at Revelation 20:12, where the book of life is opened, then read again Revelation 3 verses 1 to 6, together with the opening of the fifth seal in Revelation 6 verses 9 to 11, and correlate all this with the more lengthy description of the results of the sounding of the fifth angel in Revelation 9 verses 1 to 12. Whether one's understanding is increased or clarified or not, At least it should be noticed that the nearer we get to the seat of consciousness, the lengthier are the descriptions, the more intriguing the symbols.
And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared.
Because of the great symbology included in the pouring out of this angel, each of the verses relating to it is handled separately. It should be quite interesting to include a comparison of the results of the sounding of the sixth angel as given in Revelation 9, 10, and 11, with that shown here in verses 12 through 16. However, for this presentation, the focus of our efforts might be diverted, although hopefully one will make such comparisons as suggested following our comments on verse 16 later herein. In an effort to understand this verse's symbology and meaning, we need to consider what was said in the readings about the river Euphrates in regard to Revelation 9:14. Then we find, as in the beginning, the Euphrates. Or the good river Frat, or the river or the Fiat. Covenant, Genesis 15:18. Is being represented as being sounded now for the beginnings of the changes which have been effected by the activities of those who have preceded, who have acted upon the various influences or forces by the opening of centers, and the emotions and the understandings, and the conditions of the individual entity. Hence it represents now, as it were, to the individual. That ye now begin again to make practical or applicable, mentally, spiritually, materially, with that which has been thus far attained. Thus the Euphrates seems to indicate the beginnings of changes of such magnitude as might be shown in the coming of the kings of the east to the birthplace of Jesus, that the way might be prepared for those great changes happening then. The drying up of this river in self, now or eventually, comes from our being still before whatever happens to us as a way for the creative energies to bypass the regular flow of the self-created responses to the pineal. Or to the mind itself. This would be a drying up of the self's involvements with a change in consciousness, which means bypassing the endocrine system's activities. The drying up of the flow of self-made images along the spiritual pathways in the body seems to be the idea here. The kings of the East might be prepared as relating to our arriving at the new consciousness made possible because of the unadulterated light received by our being still.
And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet.
Historically, frogs seem to be associated with evil or unclean things. Here there were 3 of them. Not 3 from the dragon, the beast and false prophet each. They were all of one source, yet with a different meaning and purpose according to their activities and functions. They are the spirits associated with all of the willful and selfish things we do and are the activating vibrations reaching in from their source. We would suggest that these 3 frogs might well be compared with the 3 elements comprising a vibration, in which the spirit, the idea and the purpose of each are separately yet collectively all for self and self's rebellion. Here we meet for the first time in the Revelation, a reference to the false prophet. Elsewhere we have spoken of the conscious mind as being an unholy alliance between spirit and flesh minds. The self, as an identity in itself, we take to be a false being. This false being is associated with the ego, but it is the one who called into being the ego. It is also associated with the self which falls in Revelation 18, but we must await this creature's demise in Revelation 19:19.
For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty.
This verse is again the reverberation from the spirit of rebellion as it tries to influence the total earth plane. The same thing happens in us as we claim to be kings over the earth's elements. The ego has the mind we give it. That influence for self. However, there is here a threat of a battle of wills as being the final battle, as prophesied in verse 16 below.
Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame.
This is an admonishment from the Spirit in that influence of Mercury, mind itself, to the mind of man. Even though that too is what we must face by reason of what is said in the previous passages. Thus through all the functionings of the mind, we must ever be watchful lest we find ourselves unclothed, as we sometimes do in our dreams. These too come as thieves in the night and spoil our peace with ourselves. This happens to all of us when we tell a lie to keep secret something we did which we don't want known. Sometimes we repeat the lie but in a fashion which seems to betray us, and we expose the falsity of that lie. We feel naked. We are exposed. It seems as if there is a part of our minds that just will not let us get away with it. And perhaps we wish we had bitten our tongues.
And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon.
Here seems to be a verse often mentioned as the final battle which is fought out in the world, on earth, between man and the forces of evil. It is the battle preceding that great day of judgment of all mankind. This is what we were taught as a child. Somehow, even then it did not make sense in that context. It does make sense, however, in the context of what the revelation is saying to us. And that battle excludes every person in the world except us. It is a personal battle, in one's mind, between those forces in oneself which is recognized throughout one's life. Incidentally, this battle, the Battle of Armageddon, is not the battle referred to in Revelation 19:20. This needs some explanation. In the Revelation this verse describes the plagues brought about by the pouring out by the sixth angel which has the job of watching over the operations of that force we call mind, in order to see that mind conforms to what was intended in the beginning. Let us look at the verses containing the ramifications of the plagues poured out by this angel. First, the great river Euphrates dried up, then there were 3 unclean spirits, like frogs coming out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast and the false prophet. These same 3 spirits are devils, verse 14, and go about working miracles throughout the world to gather them, or just the kings of the earth, to do battle with God Almighty. There is not much said here about people. Next, the angel warns about keeping clean, then we find in verse 16 that he, apparently meaning the angel, gathered them, again, together at a place called Armageddon. All the operations concerning the 6th angel sound unearthly and mysterious, except that they must be relating to what this angel oversees, and that is the mind. And the mind is where we fight all our battles throughout life. There can be but one answer: the great day of God Almighty will come to each one of us when we can quit opposing the mind of the soul. That is a battle we all must face. It is the day of final temptation to be met by each of us, just as Jesus did in the wilderness, before we can begin to act like a son of man. Hence this great battle is fought in mind. In us. And individually, yet using every facet of mind of the flesh against those in the soul. This is the battle of our will versus God's will in our everyday living. Thus the battle takes place in us individually. This takes it out of the context of world conflagration. It is our own private battle just as Jesus fought his. And by overcoming, we become a pillar of strength in the temple of God. This overcoming might be better understood if we carefully study Revelation 3 verses 7 to 13, regarding the activities of the pineal gland, and the opening of the 6th seal in Revelation 6 verses 12 to 17, together with the rather lengthy and dramatic follow-up of actions caused by the sounding of the 6th angel. We should at least have some idea of the power of the name in the Lord's Prayer, even if we could not overcome enough to become a pillar in the temple of God, promised in Revelation 3:13.
And the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, "It is done." It
should be noticed how these plagues have already been poured out on the earth elements. The first plague was poured on the earth's creative activities in the gonads, the second and third plagues on water, and the last is into the air. The importance of these elements to us is evident by the many references to their activities in this study. The placement of the plague should be kept in mind as we move through the verses showing the effects of this particular plague. The great voice, the temple of heaven and the throne are previously shown, and all are related to the seat of consciousness. In this respect, a general consensus on the location of the seat of consciousness seems to place it somewhere in the brain. We feel that this placement may be incorrect. The proper placement is in our total physical, mental and spiritual activities. Or the body, mind and soul of the entity we call man. We add this concept here, for we are moving in our presentation to where all three aspects may seem to be associated together as one being. As a further reminder, air, to us, is the source of the expression of our temperaments, although mentally first formed, and thus is associated with what we be, as previously pointed out. It seems the words "it is done" may well be referring to the overcoming accomplished by the Son of Man in his battle of wills with Satan in the wilderness, for the presentation to John is what he experienced.
And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great.
All these symbols have previously been noted as symbols of activities associated with consciousness. The major places in the Revelation, where these specific activities are noted, will be covered following verse 19. These suggested references will not, however, include activities of consciousness not previously encountered to that point. Again, it might be well to remember that these voices here together with the thunders and lightnings all emanate from heaven, from consciousness. These particular ones would be associated with the cleansing forces, the cleansing of the memory cells of their warped response patterns. These cleansings would certainly be attendant upon a great upheaval, earthquake, in consciousness, for never before had such happened to so great an extent in man as that accomplished by the Son.
And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath.
The great city, Babylon, is of course the self. Here it is divided into 3 parts which we might well associate with the soul, mind and body, because all 3 make up the self. The cities of the nations which also fell are those warped and twisted centers of responses, as whole areas of the body's habit patterns and sources of similar memories are threatened or cleansed. The self, Babylon, came into remembrance before God because of the unearthly nature of the combination of 2 differing minds, Revelation 13. The error, the fall. The overcoming of this unholy alliance between flesh mind and spirit mind must be returned to the Father as the prodigal son. For man still in the earth, we yet must drink of this cup of the mind of the fierceness of his wrath, his law, his love.
And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found.
In previous references to islands and mountains, fixed places of reference in consciousness that we hold to. Regardless of consequences, they were merely moved out of their places. Here they are completely gone, for all memories of the fall are gone in the Son, and all body cells purified and spiritualized. All being in consciousness and our awareness.
And there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceeding great.
The great hail was found elsewhere, but here there is a difference in that every one of them have a weight of a talent. Every formed and fixed idea we have formed, as did the Son in his journey through the earth, is considered so great as to be a talent in itself. Hence heaven, our consciousness, will be purged of all our concepts of our own worth, every one of which is valued, as if we had spent lifetimes developing these talents. The realization that these are just crystallized ideas becomes like a plague of hail and causes men to blaspheme God. Instead of glorifying God for the service of allowing such false concepts to be removed from consciousness in us, we mostly still rebel. Remember that every soul unconsciously realizes that the overcoming, as well as the Son becoming the Christ, is in our soul mind, for all the world knew both the birth and death of the Son of Man at the soul mind level. The concept set forth here regarding the plagues, as well as all of Revelation 16, is what J. Everett Irion has arrived at in his study of the Revelation, although others may have more comprehensive and clearer interpretations. These ideas, however right or wrong, should be looked at in the light of this exercise. Restudy Revelation 3 verses 14 to 22, the opening of the seventh seal in the whole of Revelation 8, together with the sounding of the seventh angel in Revelation 11 verses 14 to 19, or until you note that we say that the results of the seventh angel sounding includes all the rest of the revelation, plus these plagues from the seventh angel. We dare say that, if you can come to the understanding you should, and do it, then you may well be able to do as Jesus promised. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame, and am set down with my Father in his throne.